our talk. I see some faces going up, so that means you're hearing me, and hopefully later on Evelyn as well. So
yeah, that would be great
to see you. Unfortunately, we couldn't join you live, but it's good to see at least a lot of faces instead of everyone on Zoom. So I hope you're going to enjoy our talk today. Evelyn is here as well. I presume you only see me now. We're going to switch to Evelyn soon. And we're going to talk about autonomy. Is that what we really want? And yes, that's the Spice Girl quote underneath that for the Spice Girls lovers. So as always, we like to start with a small story. So Evelyn, what's the story of today?
Yeah, that's mine for today. Hi all. I hope you can see me as well. Great to see you there instead of just talking to a black screen. So indeed, starting off with a story about autonomy that has nothing to do with the IT in this case. So last year, I bought my own house for the first time by myself. And I can tell you that felt pretty autonomous, and especially the picture on the right here, where I'm working on the floor, that felt really, really autonomous, and it felt really good. But little did I know, and call me naive, but little did I know how much decisions, options, perspectives, setbacks, frustrations, but also beautiful moments that would be. And it was pretty overwhelming, and most of the things I wanted to do by myself. I'm being a mild control freak. Kenny can probably tell you more about that. But it also felt like I was being this strong and independent woman that the society really values, right? So I wanted that autonomy, but given everything that was involved in this process, I also very much appreciated when someone else took over parts of this overwhelming process and events, let's say. So in some cases, it felt really safe when someone else said, hey, I'm going to make this decision for you. So on the one hand, I really wanted and valued that autonomy. On the other hand, it wasn't really always helping me to be fully autonomous in that sense. So when we were preparing for this talk, I remembered this feeling. And then we had a discussion or conversation about, so what does it really mean, autonomy? And what does it mean in any context? I mean, in this context alone, there are really a lot of definitions and a lot of perspectives there. And the same happens when it comes to organizations and teams. Lots of interpretations, lots of assumptions, and that's also what we want to cover in this talk. So another thing that comes to mind when thinking about autonomy, obviously, is this book, We Are Programmed in This Way. And this is basically, it's saying that to build an intrinsically motivated team, you need to focus on 3 factors, and one of them is autonomy. The other ones are mastery and purpose. If you haven't read the book, it's worthwhile reading it, but I'm guessing most of you guys know that as well here. So the key of this book, however, is it's about the combination of these factors. This is what can motivate people. It doesn't have to motivate people, and it's not a guarantee it will. And the thing with humans is that we are selective listeners. So we pick what triggers us, and then we can ignore the rest. And the same goes when we talk about socio-technical systems. They consist of both social, technical, and cognitive aspects. And sometimes we think, well, if we focus on one, and then the rest will follow. But that's not how it works. And the same goes with this book, or these 3 factors here. You cannot just focus on autonomy, because everything is influencing each other. So you have to balance that. So these are already 2 interpretations of autonomy. And Kenny, I think you have some more, right?
Yes. So if our dear friend Romeo was here, we could take the philosophical approach or the psychology approach from Eric Berne, right? But we won't be, this talk will take a few months probably, especially when Romeo, me and Evelyn is in one room. We started talking, but man is born free, but he learns to do as he's told, and it's not only man, but every person does its first enslavement. So is there really autonomy, or is it just an illusion of autonomy? We're not taking that approach today. But when you look at the really definition, so I like definitions, and when you look at the Merriam-Webster definition, autonomy is defined as the quality of state of being self-government. The right of self-government of the territory has granted autonomy, right? So you define your own rules. You define your own set of rules, and it's self-government state. Now, there's a problem here that I have if we take this into teams, into software teams, right? Let's take the software team approach. And I agree here with Jay Bloom and Mark, where they say, I hate the word autonomy. I think autonomy is individuating. The way we hear the word is, I have the right to my own decision. I have the right to make my own rules. So it can be really compulsive on every level to talk about this autonomy. Because this is what I hear when people talk, I want autonomy. Okay, you want to define your own rules, but that's not usually how it works on several levels of the organism. Because, right, Evelyn, autonomy can be compulsive.
Yeah, and this is sorry for this. This is the worst slide of the entire presentation. I put it there, but it's horrible, especially if you're suffering from OCD. But this is exactly the problem. It can be very compulsive, so it can become a goal in its own instead of a means to an end. And if we think about autonomy and isolation, that's just not gonna do it. So it's part of a bigger context. And when it's a goal in itself, then it can also translate to not knowing how to self-organize. It can lead to a lot of frustrations, lack of understanding, a lack of understanding of boundaries, which is a very important one. And we will get back to that as well. But this is a very interesting thing. And this is also where polarities come in play. So there is a polarity between isolation and connectedness when it comes to autonomy, which we will dive into this talk as well. So when it comes to autonomy, it can have both sides, right? It can have isolation and connectedness, and it's how we manage that polarity in order to get the best out of both worlds. As Kenny mentioned as well in his previous slide, and maybe you can click for me on the next one. Thank you. So autonomy is really a bold concept, and we use it as we please. Whenever we go in several or different organizations, everyone has its own definition of it, but it needs granularity. It means different things on different levels. So Kenny and I also do a lot of DDD workshop and talks, domain-driven design, and in those workshops and trainings, we always emphasize the importance of language and meaning all the time. And that's not different for autonomy. So everyone involved, when it comes to an organization or a team, needs to be on the same page about what it means, what it implies, and what not. So basically, we're talking about boundaries. What's in, what's out when it comes to autonomy. And you have to define that on multiple levels. And that's also why we're here today. So we want to dig into this concept, see what it means on the different levels. We will talk about code, organizations, teams, individuals. And we are not saying, by the way, that autonomy is a bad thing. Kenny mentioned that he hates the word autonomy, but it's about the word, right? It's not really about the thing itself. It can be a very useful and helpful thing, but you just need to be aware of a few things and think about, is this really what we want and what we need? And if so, where exactly do we want and need it? So that's basically also the first question that you can ask yourself. So where exactly do you or does your team need autonomy? So lots of teams and people that we've been to state that they want to be self-organizing and or self-steering, right? And both are marked as autonomous. But there's a difference. You can be self-organizing, but still require steering, for example. So when we were saying that language was important, well, this is also where that comes in. And very often what happens is that people are asking for a vision, usually from leadership. We need a vision. We need to know where we're going. Just do not interfere with how we're doing things, but let us know what the vision is. Where do we need to go? What's the end goal? So the first question to answer here is, what exactly do we need? Where exactly do we need and or want that autonomy? And that comes down to defining boundaries. So the ask for a vision here is also an asking people asking for boundaries as well. And that's something to keep in mind. Tell us where the boundaries are in which we can act. And that's also where leadership can shine, right? This is a role for leadership architects. They are defining those boundaries and then let the people in there create their autonomy for themselves. So first, let's visualize something in a polarity. We use something called polarity mapping all the time, which is a very useful tool to map out these polarities and see how you can manage them. So Kenny, I'm giving the floor to you for that one.
Yeah, so we're from the DDD community. We like to make things explicit. And polarities here are problems that we cannot solve. It's like asking you, okay, pick a solution, breathe in or breathe out. You can't, right? You need to balance it. Breathing in, breathing out. Luckily, we are really good at managing that ourselves, right? But some polarities here, like the part and the whole, which is what this is about, is unmanaged usually and not explicitly managed. We're not really good at it, especially from a management perspective, but also from an engineering perspective. We're not good. If you just look at pair programming versus non-pair programming, that's a polarity, right? It's working remote or working physical. It's a polarity. You cannot manage it. We need to balance it. Similar goes for this autonomy and connectiveness. So as you can see, it has two sides to polarity. One side is the part, which is the left, which is the autonomy. It's the individualism I talked about, right? And I love individualism because it has a uniqueness which we need. But there's also a problem there, which is isolation, right? Now, being connected, being part of a whole, and well, people who know social technical system thinking know part whole is something coming out of that. The whole gives you connectedness. It gives you a reason to do something, right? Together or as a company. But there's also a downside there, which is sameness, right? That's why we want autonomy. We don't want to be the same as the person next to us. We want to keep our uniqueness. You get the feeling that we need to balance these two because both sides has negative effects. So autonomy has negative effect, but also in this case, maybe bureaucracy, right? Everyone being the same has its downsides. And we need some more information to start actually manage these two polarities. And that's really important. And that's what we're going to talk about today on several aspects. But before we go in there, maybe Evelyn, you can take us to our friend's fun fact intermezzo, because we saw that thing in the middle.
Yeah, we saw the symbol, the infinity symbol, the lemniscate. And this works while we are in the same room. So I'm kind of curious how it works out right now. But we have a friend called Gien. She's from Belgium, so it's probably hard to pronounce. And this is a fun fact intermezzo. So I like to ask you the question. So this lemniscate symbol comes from the Latin word lemniscatus. So what does it mean? And then you have three options: A, round corners; B, decorated with hanging ribbons; or C, the devil's curve. And I'm not sure where we can find the answers now.
So we can also do 1, 2, 3 by raising your hands. So what do people think? Raise your hands. 1, 2, or 3, A, B, or C. I see some 3s, I see some 2s, I see some 1s. That's a hard one.
All right. Kenny, what's the correct answer?
It's decorating with hanging ribbons is the correct answer. So it's B. So that's a fun intermezzo, but Evelyn, let's continue.
Yeah, so that was a fun fact intermezzo. We have more, not in this talk, I think, but we kind of like to do this in our workshops as well. So on with the rest of the talk. As we said, we're going to talk about autonomy a lot, and we're going to talk about that on 4 different levels, let's say. So because it needs granularity, you cannot say we are talking about autonomy. It's different levels, different interpretations, different assumptions. So we're going to start off with autonomy in code. We're going to talk about it in teams, between teams, and in organizations. So Kenny, you're going to start off, right?
Yeah. So my background in software engineering, I'm still consider myself a software engineer. And when I started 12 years ago, I came into a team. We were doing Java, object-oriented. And I wanted to look at that slide. You don't need to know Java, but what we did back then is for every class, we made one test. Right? So who's done this in the past or is still doing that? Each class, you create one unit test. So, right, that's an approach you can take. See some nodding? Yeah. So the thing is, that's a strategy. And usually when I come into teams, I later find out that there are several strategies. We keep talking about outside in, inside out. Remember again, the polarity? And these are 2 sides. And when we were building this talk a while ago, Martin Fowler created this excellent blog post about the 2, actually. And there's 2 types of test. There might be more, by the way, because it's a straw man, but I define 2 basically unit testings. And one is called the sociable test. It's from Jay Fields in Working Effectively with Unit Tests, and the other one is solitary test. Again, polarity. It's sociable and it's solitary. The part is the solitary, the sociable is the whole. And often the test unit relies on the left side on other units to fulfill its behavior. So we need less mocking. And sometimes you need a solitary test because then we can isolate the test. Both approaches work in specific situation. The right one you can call more autonomous. The left one is more connectiveness. Yeah. But if we look at the goal here, what do we actually want is we want to have these coarse-grained unit tests that, well, I'm a DDDer, that tests the domain model. As long as the domain model works with the unit test, so we call that the coarse-grained unit test, the acceptance test, then for me it would be fine. But sometimes complexity, especially my core domain, sits lower, and I might do more solitary test, more focused test, right? So as I said, I'm a DDDer. We have this bounded context concept. We're going to dive into that a bit more. I'm not going to in specific, but it's a unit of consistent language, a model for a specific purpose. But what it actually is, it's a shared language. And in the shared language, we create tests together. I try to do that with example mapping, maybe some event storming, domain storytelling, all these collaborative modeling practices. And for me, these collaborative tests are also part of the bounded context, right? It's a shared model, it's a shared language. And what we can then do is, well, I like the hexagonal or ports and adapters architecture. These tests are sitting here in the top, right? We have some tests sitting here. These are the acceptance scenario. And they work on my domain model in the middle. So you see my domain model in the middle. Then when you go down, I have some objects. I'm an object-oriented person. Nothing wrong with the rest or with object-oriented if you do it all correctly. But then you have these two types of tests. One is a unit sociable test that tests multiple classes at the same time. And one is just a solitary test because maybe it's an object with a lot of complexity in it. And what I usually see happening is that we use one strategy, either the sociable or the solitary test. But we can use both. And this is a hard thing to deal with because if a junior comes in or someone from another company comes in, they ask for what are the best practices. Well, the thing is, we don't have really best practices. We have good practices. And for me, a good practice is, okay, how can we help you define when to use one test over the other? Because, and now we get back to that lemniscato, that polarity map. If you take the solitary test, the good thing is they test in isolation. They have fast feedback on failure, right? But a solitary test has also cascading changes on mocking and stubbing. And there's loss of unit of work cohesiveness. Those are the downsides. So what does a sociable test have? They have coherent testing. No mocking or no coupling. Well, a bit, maybe the outside of the domain. But failure of bug in other class and slower feedback because it tests more class, so it can have a slower feedback cycle. Both work, but we need to find out when do we use the one and when do we use the other. And that's really what for you are the downsides. When do you know you're going to go into the downside of one of these tests when you use one of these tests? Right? That's the question there, and that's the polarity. And we're going to dive into that a bit deeper because what are the signals when you do that, right? So that's a bit about a concrete example about autonomy, right? What we want is feeling secure to change the code. What we don't want is cascading changes. Autonomy lies on the solitary part, but we need to stay sociable in order to be connected with the purpose of our domain model. Both sides work. We need to manage them continuously. So don't pick a strategy, balance them out every time. So over to autonomy in teams. So this was autonomy inside the code, but we also work as a team, hopefully. So
we have to deal with people. Yeah. And that's usually where it gets interesting or frustrating or both. And that also has to do with the fact that an individual can be autonomous, but a team can also be autonomous, right? We're also talking about autonomous teams. And then talking about semantics, a team is a collection of individuals, and it can either work as one team or it's just a group of autonomous individuals. We've seen that happening as well. We are a team on paper, but we are really just acting and working as a group of autonomous individuals. I'm doing my own thing. This is my responsibility, and we'll see what happens afterwards. So the nuance here in the language, again, is crucial. And why that's the case and why autonomy in teams is also such an important topic, and we've heard it in the keynote as well this morning. We are all herd animals. So we really, really need to be liked by other people and get that confirmation. We need to belong to a group. We need to belong to a team in this case as well. But as soon as we start talking about these relationships and people dynamics and stuff like conflict and ranking and cognitive bias, then we can also get uncomfortable and we might even feel unsafe because rejection is also right around the corner. So autonomy in that sense can be very positive if you are working as an autonomous individual because you think, well, I'm just sitting here. I don't have to I don't have the chance to be rejected by the rest of the group or not belonging to that group. But on the other hand, you also want to belong to that group as well. So there's a paradox, right? We want to be autonomous, but at the same time, we want to belong to this group of people. And how do we deal with that then? So when we act as a group of autonomous individuals and we don't feel part of that herd, then we lose that feeling of belonging, which can lead to a very, very decrease in productivity. So what we kind of always like to do when we enter a team is we do some sense making. And sense making is really a strategy for us to get an idea about what the group or the team is thinking. Where does it stand? What are the different perspectives? It's also a great way to get polarities on the table. So, for example, we might just ask the question, how important is autonomy to you? And that's the first question, obviously, because it's still the bulk concept. But we ask people to get on a line of 1 to 10, and then we ask them, okay, so how important is it for you? And you get a feeling and an understanding of what the group feels like. Maybe there's a mismatch in what it means or how important it is. And this is really important to know because you have to guide that herd, let's say. And otherwise, things might get messy as well. And then it can even lead to dictatorship. And that's also what we've seen happening in a company lately. So this may sound kind of trivial. Autonomy is not dictatorship, but again, it happens. And this has also to do with the polarity that we saw in the beginning. So autonomy can lead to uniqueness, but it can also lead to isolation. And that's where it can get dangerous even. So the company that I was in was a pretty nice development team working on a product. Everyone was doing their job. But there was one person that seemed to be calling all the shots. He made all the decisions. He had the most knowledge, was there the longest. It was mostly undocumented knowledge, and that became a problem. So the person was brilliant, but it was also a huge risk. And not in the last place, because it was just about him not documenting stuff. And when he walks under a bus for, let's say, then we lose him. But it was a risk for the rest of the team because this herd was kind of not functioning anymore. So it was also very nice for the group in some cases to have one, in this case, lead developer, who was making all the decisions, because the culture of this company, there was a lot of fear and there was not a lot of room for experimentation. If you failed or if you made a mistake, you were being held accountable. So it was also kind of safe when this person was calling these shots because, hey, it's safer for me if I'm not going to speak out. But it did a lot for the social dynamics in that group. So we had an autonomous team here, or at least that's what they were calling themselves, with one autonomous individual that has most of the power. And that's where the sense making again comes in, because you have to be aware of how this group is feeling about this. If you don't define autonomy as a team, as a group of people, then that's what's going to be, it led to a clash eventually here. And it led to a lot of undesired behavior. And then a company says, well, we need to change behavior. Yeah, sure. But you have to start with the definition of these boundaries and what does it mean to everyone. And there was a lot of stuff lurking beneath the surface as well here, obviously, as you can imagine, and that needed to come out as well. So related to that, autonomy is not an excuse to hold something against someone. But it can be, and it can be a very nice and safe thing to do as well. But again, here, autonomy is a bold concept. It can be misused. Dictatorship is a potential risk, but this is also what we saw happening. So in an organization, they read something about the autonomous teams. This is what we want. This is what we need. This is gonna save us, obviously, what we sometimes hear. But a very important side note and context here is, again, there was a lot of fear in this culture. So when they were talking about autonomous teams, the teams were thinking, hey, we can be autonomous. That's great, because they won't be involved with us anymore, the leadership team in this case. We can make our own decisions. We can do whatever we want. We will be autonomous, and we won't have to deal with the social dynamics of that leadership team. The leadership team, on the other hand, was like, hey, autonomy, they are fully responsible for something. So if they fail, if they do something wrong, we can hold that against them. So they had no discussion whatsoever about boundaries. What does it mean? What do we expect from each other? And that went really, really wrong. So there are a lot of lessons in here. I think it's also very important to get on that same page, right? To get that shared sense of reality. Instead of just focusing on autonomy, first create that trust and that safe space where you can actually talk about this. So Kenny, you have some examples here as well.
Yeah, so we're talking about that connectedness. If a team gets into isolation, well, what do you need to get that team working together? And the key here again, and I'm preaching, of course, for DDD, is the bounded context, again, is a model for a specific purpose. So if a team owns a bounded context, we have a specific purpose here. We can have the connectiveness or the whole. We know what we're doing it for. That's what we're usually missing. If you deny people to model together with the business, is what I usually see, right? That tech lead, I'll talk with the business, or that analyst, I'll talk with the business, or even worse, the PO. As a gatekeeper, I'll talk to the business and I come up with the requirements, right? Then I'm not sure for what purpose I'm building this software. And the bounded context canvas works tremendously well here because that's a model for a specific purpose where we together model the business, right? It's collaboratively. And now together we know why are we doing this, for whom? Then that is usually what I see lacking in a team is that other side of the polarity, right? It's the connectiveness of that polarity I'm missing. So going into that, what I usually see in teams going well is that isolation part, right? So I saw this from a colleague of mine who went to a low-code conference and they had a problem. They grow together, delivery teams slow down because they compete to change the same code. This is a big red flag that you're lacking connectiveness. You're lacking that purpose because why would it be that developers need to deliver at different pace? For me, it doesn't make sense because we should do this together for that specific purpose. And the problem here is not to go branching. While branching is a good thing, but it's an isolation pattern. Again, here is the lemniscat or the thing again. Usually people pick one branching strategy, like feature branching or trunk-based development. While if you look really at trunk-based development, it actually says that you can do branching. So there's no wrong there. But usually people say we always do a feature branch. Well, that's one strategy. That's an isolation pattern, right? Because what happens here, if you see, there's no real feedback on the branches, right? The feedback is there once you merge back on the main branch, but it's sometimes really late. One day is still fine. If you do really proper continuous integration, it's one day max, you need to go back to the main line, right? But what I see happening, and that's a big signal that you're working in isolation, if I see feature branches that are longer than a day, then we need to start working together, pair up, start looking, hey, maybe you're competing on the same lane. I'm still fine with things like feature branching as long as it's max one day for myself, for my team. Sometimes when things get more complex, it might be so that we do it longer, but it happens often that it's longer than one day. Then there is that imbalance of the two, right? And the real problem here is the further you are on a branch, something will happen, right, Evelyn?
Yes, some cost fallacy can happen. So this is one of the cognitive biases that we see a lot in organizations. And the further that you go down into that branching rabbit hole, the more you'll get into isolation. And that means that you will lose connection with others and the shared models, and the bigger the risk of sunken cost fallacy. So why change now? We've already wasted so much money. It's a bit of a sarcastic line there, but it is what's happening, because there will come a time when you need to merge eventually, and you already spent so much time on it, and then it gets really hard to throw it all away. So this is something that you really need to be on the lookout for, also in your own behavior there, because it's easier to see with others, but probably you're doing it yourself as well.
Yeah, and when you look at that part, right, it's branch versus trunk base. When this happens, so you compete to change the same code, what do you need to do? Start pairing, start ensemble programming, look each other up. Again, branching gives you freedom. It gives you individual creativity, which is perfect. But as soon as you loss of cohesion of mental models, then you're getting into the downside of the polarity again. Then you need to switch to the other side. Because there it's the care for the whole, the shared mental model and the team effort, right? But if you do that for long, you have excessive conformity. So that's why pair switching helps. So you still need that individual creativity. You need them both. So when I see this Twitter battle going on, ensemble is better, but no, feature branching is better. Yes, they're both ands. They're not either or. That's what we're trying to succeed. Just knowing when to go from the one to the other is the key of making a balanced autonomy in the end, because then we're always in a releasable state instead of we're getting a lot of bugs, or late feedback. Yeah? So the autonomy here is sitting in balancing branches and trunk-based development, for instance, inside your team. So let's look at now autonomy between teams and the ivory tower. Right. So recently it's already been a few years, and I'm not sure who've read Team Topology in the room. Anyone read Team Topology? See a few hands going up. So Team Topology really loves domain-driven design. Team Topology talks about several ways you can organize development teams around, right? So now we're going to get into the interaction between the teams. And they define 4 specific types of teams, which is first the complicated subsystem team, meaning if you need to do something really special that for instance, when you need to do, I had a friend who was doing photos recognitions on microservices. That's really specific expertise. You do that in a complicated subsystem team. Now, so you have probably heard about the platform team, right? If several teams need to use a platform to build and work on, then you get a platform team. And then you have the most important one, which is a stream-aligned team. Yeah. So the stream-aligned team are the product teams or value teams, whatever you want to call them. And these are teams that are delivering value for their users. And then you have an enabling team. And these enabling teams are sort of like teams that enable new technology or enable new stuff inside the team. They're sometimes teams that just exist for a specific point in time. And then they separate because they've done their purpose. Yeah. And a big thing in team topology is that we should be thinking about limiting the size of software, services, and product to cognitive load that the team can handle. So look at how much load can a team handle. If I have like 100 systems or microservices in a team, that's a lot of cognitive load to handle, right? So the only way to really measure this is ask the team, right? What I did in my sprint retrospective is check. Okay, how much cognitive load do you experience this month? Then you can see a thread, right? Do we need to split the team? Do we need to have more people in? These are nice details, right? So, but one thing why these two teams love each other, or why Team Topology loves DDD, is because in DDD we have these strategic patterns. And one of these patterns is the partnership pattern. And the partnership pattern is a cooperative relationship between the two teams. If you collaborate that much, you get into that sameness again, right? You're getting on the one side of not being autonomous. And people who think about autonomy as a team, then you don't think really about the partnership, because there's a lot of planning and there's a lot of talking against each other. But partnership is not really that bad. I usually, and this is what they say in team topology as well, we usually start with a partnership between teams. Let's say we have a platform team that needs to build new stuff for one of their teams. They're going to go into collaboration mode. And that's a partnership for you. So start with the partnership, and maybe later on you can extract this as a surface collaboration. So these are not stable again. It's not one strategy, but you need to make how are the teams doing now? Can we now split them over time? You need to constantly keep checking. And these are really roles for tech leads inside the teams, working with each other, checking this out, or a architect that keeps facilitating this, or an engineer. But these are not wrong patterns. Yes, if you go autonomy all the way, then you won't be using this partnership pattern. But they're still a very viable pattern. And then the second thing is these enabling teams, right? What we usually see is we have a team of architects somewhere outside the teams. They're not delivering relief value. Who's ever witnessed this? So like the ivory tower architect, for instance. You want to ever witness an ivory tower architect? They're just there sitting in a team. You don't know if they're delivering value or not, but usually they're annoying, right? But the thing about an enabling team here is that they're dynamic as well. An enabling team should be non-permanent. They should have a goal. So enabling team actively avoid becoming ivory towers of knowledge, dictating technical choices for other teams to follow. What they do is, what is our goal? When are we finished enabling? Yeah. So for me, a good model is software architects sit inside teams, and you have solution architects who are non-permanent but take on projects to move new architectures inside and facilitate inside the teams. They should not be permanent, in my opinion, because then you get into this mode that they just pump out all these nice diagrams and nobody's actually using. Right? They're really great, but they're not really delivering any value to anyone anymore. It's just nice, these diagrams and boxes. Right? So what happens there is, when we get back to that polarity map, is, well, they're in isolation, right? And then they become, they're in freedom, because now they have all the freedoms and it's great. They're going to start on a new project that the teams cannot handle because they're in high cognitive load. And then they need to facilitate that point at one of the teams. The problem is they get into isolation, they're becoming selfish, but at some point you also get the downside. If you stay in one of these polarities for a long time, you get the downside of both polarities, just so you know. So the longer you're there, the more excessive conformity you need to have at some point. Yeah. So you will experience both downsides, which will make it worse, but it's a nice thing to see. Oh, we're expecting both sides of these isolation and collaboration tables. So you're going to get into the Tower of Babel, but what you want to do is customer centricity, right? And that's really my gist, and I cannot have a talk without this framework, right? That's my gist with this framework. It works, but you need to manage the polarities when it's useful and when it's not. Yeah. So there's a lot of isolation going on here, in my opinion, but we need to become balanced between isolatedness and collaboration. So I've talked long enough for between teams autonomy. So Evelyn, let's talk about autonomy in organization.
Yeah, happy to see the SAFE framework again. Makes my day as well. So indeed, autonomy in organizations, and basically what the gist here is that it's a continuous negotiation. Because sometimes when we are talking about autonomy and autonomous teams, what about leaders? What about leadership teams? What about management? Usually autonomous teams are not in the context of on that level. So the thing here is, like I said, it's a continuous negotiation. What do we mean with autonomy in this organization? Where do we want to provide it? Where do we need it? And what does it bring us? What in the end is it going to bring us when we are organizing for autonomy? What are the results that it will give us? So what does autonomy mean in the way that we collaborate, in the way we behave? How do we make decisions? How do we structure our teams? And as a leader, what does it mean for your role? Are you still needed in your role? If autonomy is everywhere, do we still need leaders? Do we still need architects? All questions that are very, very important in this context, and starting off with a vision, boundaries, or both. So as said in the beginning of the talk, defining the boundaries, that's, in our opinion, something that a leadership team needs to shine in. The leadership team should do this. So vision comes from leadership usually. And when people are asking for vision or strategy, it's usually a cry or a ask or a need for boundaries. And that's a lot what we hear in teams, a call for boundaries. Tell us what the boundaries are in which we can decide how we work. So basically what leadership does, in our opinion, or architects or people who are coordinating this, is coordinating this autonomy. And autonomy exists within boundaries, and these boundaries can be translated into a vision. So when you think about your vision, and that needs to be communicated to teams as well and to the rest of the organization, it's all about these boundaries. What do people need? And that isn't a free pass, by the way, because it still requires a continuous negotiation and conversation about what it then actually means when we are saying we need to be autonomous. What does that look like? What does it look like being autonomous? What am I going to see you doing or hear you saying? It's all about consequences and expectations there and what it should result in. So those are the conversations and the negotiations that leadership, in our opinion, should constantly be having. Another question that we sometimes get is, so, okay, autonomy, fine, makes sense, but who calls the shots now? And that can be confusing, because when we are getting towards more autonomy and we are talking about decision-making, for example, The question arises, okay, so what am I allowed to do? Which decisions am I or is this team allowed to make? And what are the consequences of those decisions? So that's a hard question in general, but especially when it comes to autonomous teams. And you have to be on the same page about that. And again, it's a continuous negotiation between leadership and teams teams on their own. If you agree on what it means, what you can expect from each other and where the boundaries are, then you can also determine or decide who gets to make which decisions. And then eventually it will become way more clear what it is that we need and what we are talking about actually, instead of just an excuse of holding something against someone or increasing that fear in the organization. And again, these boundaries here are very, very important. Another thing that we hear when it comes to autonomy within organizations is, okay, we gave them autonomy. Why aren't they doing anything with it? This is a quote, notice the they and them in this. It's all about someone else. So this was a pretty frustrated leadership team, and they were like, okay, we gave them autonomy. We give them what they wanted. So why is no one taking ownership or responsibility? Why is no one acting and jumping on that autonomy? So the first question that I asked them is, okay, so what can you do to help them take that ownership, to take that autonomy? And before that question, it's important to have a conversation about, okay, so did you assume that these teams wanted autonomy, or is it actually what they wanted, and to what extent, and where do they need that autonomy? But that's something, again, also for another talk. But sometimes it is the case that people don't seem to jump on that autonomy because they don't feel safe enough, for example. Maybe they are not feeling safe enough to take on that responsibility or to actually make a decision. Maybe they are not even sure which decisions they can make, and they feel that it can be held against them. So they are not comfortable with that level of responsibility, that level of autonomy. And that's where leadership comes in as well, in our opinion. It's up to a leadership team to create an environment where people actually can jump onto that autonomy, where they feel it's safe to take a risk, where they can experiment, and where they can fail. So this is worth a negotiation and a conversation as well. If you see this happening in your organization or in your team, okay, so what's holding people back? Why isn't this working out the way we planned? Why aren't we getting the results that we were aiming for? So what are people afraid of? What risks do they see? Do they feel safe? And again, with a lot of sense making, you can get an idea on this as well. Sorry. So when there is autonomy everywhere, do we still need managers and architects and leaders? Are they still needed? And the consultant answer, obviously, it depends. But in our opinion, they will never lose their value. It's just a matter of rethinking your role and rethinking your value in autonomous teams or in autonomous organizations even. But the most important job or the most important task for leaders, in our opinion, is to create that environment where there is psychological safety, where you can negotiate the boundaries, where you can translate strategy into boundaries, and very important, manage polarities. So that means that as a leader, it's very important to be aware of all the polarities that are going on in a team or an organization. And that's a very hard skill to learn, I think, but it's a very important one. So keep an eye out, listen to the teams, what's happening, where are the polarities, and how can I manage them? So it's also something. It also has something to do with centralized and decentralized decision making, and I think we also put that into a polarity map, right, Kenny?
Yes. So this is the real question. Usually, is who takes decision and on what. So again, this is the polarity between what Evelyn already says: decentralized and centralized, right? So what you see when we take centralized decision, it's empowering to the group. Group can coordinate, group acting decisively, and everyone feels included if you do it centralized, right? But the problem is you get cues, you get no creativity or spontaneously, lack of individual accountability. So what do we need? We need maybe decentralized decision-making, which is on the left, which is empowering the individual, it's spontaneous, and it's individual acting decisively. Do you hear the recognition with the other polarity maps that we showed you before? They all talk about the isolation and the connectiveness, and both have the downside, like the isolation is group cannot coordinate, you get fear of missing out and feeling left out, and it's a burden of the consequences from mistake. So the decentralized decision is really autonomy, right? Because you get to make your own rules, but we still need to centralize the group actively decide part. And both of these together we call agency, right? Within boundaries, we are able to make decisions, but we know what that decision impacts the rest of our environment, organization, whatever you want to call it. And it's up to the tasks of the management to, in my opinion, to manage this, middle management especially. They need to manage, can a team already take that or not? Some teams can do decentralized or centralized. And for me, you always want to keep that balance up, making sure that teams get to agency. They know what their decision impacts in the whole, and they know that they can take their autonomous teams. What I saw one day with an autonomous team is that they went fully to decentralized decision. But now I started talking about decision that needed to be made over the group. And what happened there is, yeah, but we need the other team. And I said, well, can't you just talk to them? No, because they decide their own backlog and their priority. You see the disconnect now? And that's what managers or architects or people facilitating these conversations and making sure people know this. That's what we do with polarity mapping, making sure that people see both downsides. If they don't see both downsides, they will only see they only see the opposite polarity downside, and then they know they're right because their upside of the polarity they're in is confirming that they're doing the right thing. They need all the people in the room doing this polarity mapping together so you can get all sides out. And then you can start to balance these two polarities. And one thing that you can be certain of, if the management isn't doing this, it's probably fractal and it triggers down. This is what we call fractal patterns. So if there's a pattern of isolation or autonomy from the leadership, you can be blatantly sure that it drips down to your code, because that's how fractal patterns in cultures work. So just so you know, if you spot the pattern on one of these scopes, levels, then it's probably somewhere else as well. Maybe, not always, but it's usually what I see. So autonomy, is that what we really want? Well, I'm more of an agency person. Stay connected, stay balanced, manage that polarity, define and negotiate the boundaries continuously. And that's what we want. And that ends the talk. And we're always leaving the judging to the cats. Thank you very much. You can find more information on our Twitter, blogs, everything. And now it's time for some questions. Thank you.
Oh, it's nice to see people clapping without hearing them.
Yes. So I already saw one before. I'm not sure if someone's facilitating it in the group, but I saw one on Slack. And the question was, max one day on a feature branch, do you expect the team to code review and merge those branches daily, or don't you advocate code reviews? Definitely advocate code reviews. I'm more of a collaborative person who reviews it continuously instead of a point in time, because that's, for me, is a lock. But what worked for me, and again, this is my own heuristic, is I'm a trunk-based development person. If someone commits on the main branch and I'm pulling that because I want to commit, I'm reviewing their code. That's continuous code reviewing for me, and that works. But I expect the team to at least review or collaborate on it and merge those branches daily. Yes, definitely. And I'm all for reviewing, but stay connected and stay in that feedback for longer. So, any more questions from the audience?
I think you can also ask them in the Slido app. Don't see anything there yet. Well, I think we will wish you a nice lunch.
Okay, then thanks. Thanks for hosting us and having us, and enjoy your days there.